Hey everyone, Megan here. Before we get to this week's podcast, I want to say a couple of things. The first is a big thank you. The podcast launched just over a month ago, and the response has been overwhelming, with thousands of downloads for each episode and tons of enthusiastic comments and helpful suggestions. The podcast is currently free, and I'm committed to keeping it that way. But in order to do that, I need your support. So you know what's coming. I have set up an unspeakable Patreon page. There you have the opportunity to subscribe at 3 different levels, in return for which I'm offering a number of benefits and opportunities. They range from early access to the podcast, access to bonus content, in some cases entirely separate interviews not available to the public, and the opportunity to join private forums and live video streams. And just so you know, I already have an amazing interview available on the page for subscribers at the second level tier. It's a long and pretty intimate conversation I had with comedian Chelsea Handler late last year at her home. We talk about all sorts of things: sex, dating, not having children, the changing nature of comedy, and how she had to go to sexual harassment training during the shooting of her Netflix documentary, Hello Privilege, It's Me, Chelsea. If you're interested, become a patron at patreon.com/theunspeakable, and you'll be able to hear it right now, plus all sorts of other extras in the near future. In any case, I'll say it again, I'm so grateful to you for listening to the podcast, and I'm excited to continue to bring it to you. And with that, here's episode 6.
We argued that by observing thousands of dog gentles and unwanted humping in dog parks, we could confidently declare that nightclubs were rape-condoning spaces and men should be trained like dogs, using black feminist criminology, which clearly has no relevance there at all. We also argued that people could become more feminist. Men could become more feminist and less transphobic by inserting dildos into their anus. And this was apparently tested and argued for. And we argued that fat bodybuilding should be a thing, because the only reason we admire bodies that are built with muscle and not ones that are built with morbid obesity is because we have been conditioned to be fat phobic.
Welcome to the 6th edition of the Unspeakable podcast. I'm meghandaum. My guest is author Helen Pluckrose. Her new book, which she co-wrote with James Lindsay, is Cynical Theories: How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. If you're at all familiar with the so-called woke wars, or the ideological divide between traditional liberals and the progressive left, you may have heard about how the social justice ideology that's come to dominate the new left is undergirded by philosophical movements like Postmodernism, critical theory, and standpoint epistemologies that inform books like the currently massively popular White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. But what do those terms mean exactly? And are they really a useful framework for creating a more just society? Helen explains all of that and more in our conversation. She also defines and explains the term intersectionality, which, admit it, you probably don't fully understand, even though it's everywhere now. That alone should be worth the price of admission. I probably should have put it behind the Patreon. It's that valuable. But I give it to you for free as a public service. So here's my interview with Helen Pluckrose. Helen Pluckrose, thank you for being on the Unspeakable podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
This book, which you've written with James Lindsay, is one of those that I think we've desperately needed, but perhaps not quite realized just how desperately. People from any number of ideological camps on the left and the right and everywhere in between who've found themselves confused and exasperated by certain, I guess you could say, dogmatic manifestations of social justice activism, really don't always understand what's underneath all of it. So I think this is a really useful and, not to mention, incredibly thorough and rigorous kind of guidebook. Can you just tell us what made you decide to write it and what you're hoping people will take away from it?
Well, we're trying to sort of make the underlying worldview more comprehensible, because it's really quite counterintuitive. And it's not as complicated as people think it is, because they'll read an abstract of the theory and they'll think, I could never get my head around that. It can seem more daunting and complicated than it is, when really it is just a couple of principles and a few themes that just get recycled in different contexts. And once you get your head around them, it's much easier, I would say, to disagree with them, to counter them. But also, if you want to take some of their insights, if you think it has value, it's easier to do that as well. I want it to be submittable to the marketplace of ideas, which it currently isn't.
Well, say more about that. Like, why do you think there's been such a resistance to actually figuring out what's behind the kind of popular versions we're seeing of this kind of sensibility?
Well, I think for most people, it just doesn't seem to make much sense, and it isn't very interesting. And to be fair, to get really into this, you do have to spend several years studying it before it slots into place and you can kind of map it out, because otherwise it doesn't sink in. And I think if you want to address something, you have to have really quite a lot of it. And very few people spend significant time reading ideas and theories that they don't think has value. So there's just not many people doing that. So sometimes when people will critique it, it will be too shallow, or it will misunderstand something quite central. And so we wanted to really break it down.
So Helen, what is your background? You're often referred to as the British academic Helen Pluckrose. So that's a little mysterious. Can you tell us where you're coming from with all of this?
Yeah, I didn't go to university until I was in my 30s. I was in nursing and social care for most of my time. But then after I had a stroke, I went to university and I studied English literature at undergraduate, and then late medieval and early modern writing at postgraduate. And my area of interest is looking at the ways in which late medieval women and early modern women negotiated the Christian narrative to get to attain authority and autonomy for themselves, which was lacking at these times. So that's my area of interest. But I'm always interested in ideologies and narratives and how people make moral meaning and purpose out of them. So I've carried on doing that kind of thing. Peter, Jim and I, we were all quite involved in that new atheist moment. So we've been quite critical of religious narratives that weren't rooted in evidence and had quite a liberal tenet. So it really just kind of made sense to address this social justice thing when it came up and it started behaving in the same ways, when it started being anti-science, illiberal, anti-freedom of speech, anti-freedom of belief. So yes, it was definitely somewhere we were going to end up.
So this is fascinating. Did you grow up in a religious family?
No, my parents were both atheists, but I became religious because we have Christian teaching in schools over here. So I had myself baptized and confirmed, and I became very religious. And then I got quite ill over it. I had suffered from OCD, known as scrupulosity, which was related to the religious.
Wait, scrupulosity, is that like the religious term for OCD? I've never heard that. It's sounds much better than OCD.
Yeah, well, it's a variant on it. It's when because with the OCD, you've got the obsessive and the compulsive part.
Right.
So the obsessive part is the thoughts. And so when you have, it's sometimes just called religious OCD or scrupulosity, is when you're examining yourself very, very closely and that you're always afraid that you've done something wrong, you've harmed someone, you've committed a sin. And this is a form of OCD which is quite difficult to treat. So I suffered from that. And it's sort of also given me a bit of insight, because when I'm reading the work of people like Robin DiAngelo, and she's relating her own unconscious bias, I have a very strong connection with this. I really think there is something psychological and obsessive going on there.
We are talking about the emergence of a movement really in academia initially, but ultimately in the culture more broadly, that is sort of taking the theoretical a substitute for reality. And we're seeing it play out in different sorts of ways. And we're seeing it really come across mostly like in terms of purity policing would be one of the terms, or let's just have it. I want to just, for our listeners, like, let's throw out a couple of concrete examples. What were the kinds of things you were seeing as an academic? When you were an academic, was this movement afoot? Were you seeing this kind of dogmatism, or is it something that you've noticed more in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I saw it both in an academic and in an activist context. So I was considered problematic for saying that sexual selection was real and might go some way to explain why men are particularly attracted to young and beautiful women, and women are particularly attracted to successful men. That was considered heresy. It became increasingly difficult to address women's issues and women's social history if you have to assume that absolutely everything is culturally constructed. That isn't how it works in men and women's different approach to religion, for example. And I really wanted to take that up and look at it, but it just wasn't possible. And then in activism, because I was combining my liberal feminism with my secularism at this point, and I was trying to give some support to ex-Muslims and feminist and LGBT activist Muslims, and I was having so much difficulty with intersectional feminists insisting that this was racist. Meanwhile, liberal and ex-Muslims that are trying to address some quite serious misogyny and homophobia and not getting any support with that. So this kind of inconsistency of principles really, in the end, that caused me to write the essay, Why I No Longer Identify as a Feminist, because I think that the concept just crept so much I could no longer really define myself by it. I still am particularly focused on gender issues and committed to gender equality, and I'm more interested in average on how women experience things, but feminism isn't something I can get behind anymore.
The fact that you came from the real world, like the fact that you were a nurse and a care worker and then went into academia, that's an unusual route, to say the least. Do you think that the fact that you were not like somebody who was an academic from the very beginning, that you had experience in quote unquote reality, made these sorts of things seem all the more absurd and troubling to you?
Quite possibly. I mean, I never qualified as a nurse. I did some training and worked in some hospitals, but generally, the sort of minimum wage care work for elderly and disabled people. So I think, I was a care assistant married to a forklift driver, and we weren't exactly, we were living from paycheck to paycheck, but I don't think that this is a sort of a class issue. My background, my parents' background is quite solidly middle class. I was privately educated. So there's a whole lot of influences in there. But I think the important thing for me was having had some problems with magical thinking and a really quite intense and negative relationship with religion, and then having used some tools to overcome that and to, developed a strong sense of the importance of evidence-based epistemology and consistently liberal ethics. That has just been the thing that has guided everything I've ever done since.
Now, talk about your article. Is it Why I'm No Longer a Feminist? Was that the title?
Yeah.
And when did it appear? And was that sort of your first shot over the bow in terms of your involvement in this whole intellectual sphere?
I think so, yes. That was the first one that went viral. I wrote it in 2016, and I'd already been arguing online for about 5 years that there was a problem within feminism, but that feminism was still very much needed. I was arguing with people who were saying that feminism had lost the plot, that it was no longer liberal, it was no longer effective. And I got into so many arguments about this. And then in the end, I just gave up. I just had to say, okay, you're right. The movement known as feminism now is not what I wanted it to be. I'm not helping. I'm 46. I always identified as a liberal feminist.
Yeah.
So my mother was a second wave liberal feminist. She arrived in London in 1960, and she took on the bank that she worked for because they wouldn't let women take accountancy exams, and she couldn't get a mortgage without a male guarantor.
Right.
So she addressed these very liberal issues. I have always thus thought of myself as a liberal feminist. I've had disagreements with the radical feminists because they are the ones who believe that society is dominated by a patriarchy, by rape culture, that men are an oppressor class and women are the oppressed class. I could never agree with that. The liberal feminist is one who thinks society is already pretty good, but not everybody has equal access to everything. We don't want a revolution. We want to open things up for people who can't currently access. So liberal feminism is generally regarded by both the radical feminists and the intersectional feminists now as being too complacent about the status quo.
Okay, and since you said the word intersectional, I was hoping you could define intersectionality for us once and for all. This will be the definitive the explanation.
Okay, so there's two symbols here that you need, and one comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, which is that of intersectionality, and the other comes from Patricia Hill Collins, which is the matrix of domination. So what you have in both cases is this idea that people with multiple forms of marginalized identity can be hit by prejudice and discrimination in all sorts of ways that aren't easily detectable, that you can't easily pin down. So for Kimberly Crenshaw, she used the symbolism of an intersection. And if somebody is black and a woman and they are standing in the intersection, they can get hit by racism or sexism or by a combination of both. So I think there's quite a lot of validity in this idea, and particularly she was a legal scholar.
Right.
And she pointed out, as did Patricia Hill Collins, that there were specific stereotypes that accrued to black women. They couldn't be straightforwardly be called sexism because they didn't apply to white women. And they couldn't straightforwardly be called racism because they didn't apply straightforwardly to black men. So there was something there that there needed to be a recognition. And if people are skeptical of this now, I tend to ask them, can you ever see a situation in which a combination of being straight, white and a man could discredit you in any situation? If you can, then it should be quite clear that this can happen, you know? There is some basis for this idea of an intersectionality that we need to keep aware of this. Unfortunately, it was always quite a problem because the first thing Crenshaw did was she defined intersectionality as contemporary politics, by which she meant quite radical politics of the new left kind, applied to postmodern theory. So she's beginning with a denial of objective reality, with a belief that everything is culturally constructed. And she explicitly took aim at liberalism, which aimed to get rid of social significance from identity categories. So we didn't believe, my doctor will be a man, my nurse will be a woman, right, my accountant will be white, my gardener will be Mexican, or whatever. So liberal aim was to get rid of this significance. And this means focusing less on identity. Doesn't mean being blind to racism or sexism. That is frowned upon and opposed as needed. But it does mean we don't focus constantly on identity. We try and make it irrelevant for moral purposes. But Kimberly Crenshaw and the others who are sort of rising at that time, including Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, they saw a need for a focus on identity politics over universal liberalism. They wanted to put the power within the identity group. And this, I think, was bound to go horribly wrong. I think it was bound to cause division, cause tribalism, the rejection of any kind of stable reality, and the assertion that everything is culturally constructed in the service of power was just going to make everything messy and hostile. And that's essentially what's happened.
You organize your explanation of postmodern thinking into 6 concepts in the book. So there's the knowledge principle, which has to do with radical skepticism and whether objective truth or knowledge even exists. There's postmodern political principle, the belief that society is formed around systems of power and hierarchies. And then you talk about the blurring of boundaries, the power of language, cultural relativism, the loss of the individual and the universal. So, I can imagine how this kind of gets toyed with in academia and, like a very kind of abstruse academic paper. But can you talk a little bit about how you see this play out just in popular culture? I mean, I'm assuming when you wrote your piece about how you were no longer identifying as a feminist in 2016, I mean, that was before Me Too, but it was really, I'm assuming you were reacting to a sort of iconography of quote unquote intersectional feminism. And so I'm wondering, like, if you could talk about how you kind of piece this whole puzzle together.
Yeah, I mean, what we see in popular culture, and this is where it's getting its power from, so yes, you can get quite complicated in academic papers, but really these same principles are quite straightforward, and we all see them. Whenever we have a claim that people need to stay in their lane, that white men can't talk about this, that cisgendered people can't talk about this, this is the idea that knowledge is not objective, that knowledge comes from experience. I have my truth, you have your truth has already been spoken too much. We have to listen to black women, listen to trans women, but only the ones who agree with intersectionality, obviously. So that's where we get the sort of denial of objective truth. And we see that most explicitly in areas like queer theory and trans activism. So there's, that there is certain evidence in neuroscience which may well, at some point soon, explain to us why some people are trans. So that there is an objective truth there. But a lot of the trans activists want to break down those boundaries between male and female, masculine, feminine, heterosexual, homosexual. They see them as explicitly oppressive. And so any language which kind of insists on categories of objective truth is seen as oppressive. And this is why sometimes the most extreme trans activists who do not at all represent the majority of trans people can really seem quite delusional to the sort of average person who doesn't want any harm to come to any trans people. But so, yeah, this is the kind of example we see of this. We see the power and privilege, the systems of... So the political principle is the one to really get your head around. It's this idea that we create reality with the way we talk about things. Now, powerful people in society... Powerful groups have decided what kind of talking about things is legitimate and what kind isn't. And then everybody else throughout society speaks in these ways, which perpetuates these systems of power, privilege, oppression.
And these ideas, sorry to interrupt you, the powerful people are would be stereotypically white men.
Straight white men,
cis straight white men. And is the thinking that these ways of talking about things have been established centuries ago, millennia ago, decades ago? How far back do they trace it?
A lot of it, especially from Foucault, he focuses, particularly when it comes to things like sexuality, from the 19th century, but he takes a very long historical look. And this is what we will see in a lot of the activism as well. They see these systems as having been set up at certain times and then just evolving rather than improving. So a big part of critical race theory is the claim that things aren't actually getting better racially, they just change what they look like. So you have slavery at first, then you have Jim Crow, now you have the carceral system. It's all the same thing. It's all white supremacy, whiteness, privilege, and trying to control and oppress the black person. But it looks different in each age. So what these kind of theorists and activists consider their job to be is to make these systems of power and privilege visible. And they do this in a highly interpretive way where they will close read what somebody has said. They believe that there is always a power imbalance going on. So one of the central tenets of critical race theory that was set up by a group including Robin DiAngelo is the question is not did racism occur, but how did racism manifest in that situation? So you begin with the assumption that any interaction between a black person and a white person is going to have racist elements, and then you try to find evidence of it.
You were part of a now infamous academic hoax a few years ago, commonly referred to as Sokal Squared. That's a reference to another famous hoax from the mid-1990s put forth by the physicist Alan Sokal, who, in trying to prove how intellectually lazy certain academic fields had become, got a paper published in a leading cultural studies journal, basically arguing that reality didn't exist. I can't remember the exact details of his thesis, but in 2017, you and your co-author, James Lindsay, who's a mathematician, along with a philosophy professor, Peter Boghossian, wrote, I think, 20 fake papers using trendy but frankly absurd jargon in an effort to see if you could get them published. A number of them were. Can you describe some of the papers and how they were received by editors as well as other academics?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's often sort of misunderstood about our project, especially when it's compared to Alan Sokal's, is that while Alan took a lot of the jargon and then, I mean, if you're a physicist, the paper he wrote is extremely funny because he's deliberately reversed things. It's lost on me because I'm not a physicist, but it was nonsense and it was intended to be nonsense. What we did, which was very different to what Alan Sokal did, was we actually reproduced the arguments. Our papers are indistinguishable from ones that are published completely sincerely. Some of our data is fake, and they should have recognised that it was either impossible, implausible, or certainly that we were drawing unwarranted conclusions from it. But the rest of the theoretical papers are just solid scholarship of the kind that they wanted to publish. So if they are not ashamed of that, they should actually keep it up there, even if we didn't believe in it. So we argued, for example, that there is no legitimate way to criticise social justice. Anybody who does this in any way is being a bully. Only marginalised people can use humour. Anybody who uses humour to laugh at the social justice excesses is being a bully. They're using disparagement humour. They should be punished. That one got accepted fastest of all. Then we had some really silly things that people remember, whereas when we argued that by observing thousands of dog gentles and unwanted humping in dog parks, we could confidently declare that nightclubs were rape-condoning spaces and men should be trained like dogs, using black feminist criminology, which clearly has no relevance there at all. We also argued that people could become more feminist. Men could become more feminist and less transphobic by inserting dildos into their anus. And this was apparently tested and argued for. And we argued that fat bodybuilding should be a thing, because the only reason we admire bodies that are built with muscle and not ones that are built with morbid obesity is because we have been conditioned to be fat phobic. So they're nonsense papers. They're not only absurd, they're also really unethical in their conclusions. So, yeah.
Unethical how? How do you mean? I can see where they're absurd, but what do you mean by unethical?
Well, we argue that we always find that the problem in any situation is that men are horrible, for example. That was the thesis that we got published over and over again. You know, one of the papers was we were looking into why men like to look at attractive, scantily clad women. Now, the answer to most people would be because most men are heterosexual. But we had to argue instead that it was because they valued patriarchy and they wanted to dominate women. And, you know, this was one of the ones that got published. I think with the most unethical one of all, but nobody ever remembers this paper because it wasn't funny, is the one that's called When the Joke's on You, in which we argued that you just cannot, no criticism of social justice ideas is legitimate at all. It needs to be shut down. It needs to be punished. You know, there's a part of us that was hoping that Hypatia, who accepted it, would actually say, no, this is unethical. This is authoritarian. We can't publish something saying this. But they accepted it in 9 days. They called it an excellent contribution to feminist philosophy.
And do they ask for any edits? What kind of editorial process is there, if any?
Yeah, they didn't ask for a lot for that one, but with some of them, they wanted us to make things more insane in many ways. They They wanted us to take some of the evidence out. They said that our data would be confusing, and just to remove it at one point and not and just make the claims without it. They asked us to, we included, I can't even remember his name. He's one of your left-wing public figures, a comedian, John somebody. We had to, we were asked to put in that he was a white privileged man.
John Stewart, the Daily Show?
Yes.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, there was, when we wrote our piece, our paper, which was essentially a rewrite of Mein Kampf, we just bent the theory to fit it. So intersectional theory, it's not, some people have said we just took Jews out and put men in, but it wasn't that simple. We had to bend the theory around it, but the totalitarian language was the same. They asked us to change that because they were afraid that we were too liberal.
Wow.
And they wanted us to be more social justice, because there's a real negativity towards liberalism in the whole field. I think they spend more energy criticizing liberals, by which I mean the philosophical tradition. It's
Right.
more common on the left, but it doesn't mean the left. But that value for freedom of speech, freedom of belief, reforming things, making people more free and more equal. So they're more hostile to that than they are to properly conservative ideas, or even downright sort of far right ideas.
Really? Really?
But one of the central tenets that comes up over and over again is in critical race theory is critique of liberalism. It doesn't say critique of conservatism. And obviously, there's a matter. They see liberalism as the main competitor. And it is. And that's why quite often people are more annoyed with those who have the same aims but different methods,
right,
than they are with people who have different methods. So people will often ask me why I, somebody who is still very much of the left, spend so much energy criticizing another part of the left. And this is because this gets to me much, much more than whatever problems are happening on the other side. And this is how they feel too. They are after liberals and to a certain extent Marxists, because we're looking at things in a much more sort of freedom-orientated, viewpoint diversity, marketplace of ideas way, which they think is holding back the progress that they would like to see.
And again, just for people who are maybe not so familiar with the way the word liberalism has been sort of, the contours of it have changed over the last several years. I mean, I certainly grew up thinking there were liberals and there were conservatives, in the US anyway, and that was the binary. Now we have progressives, which are different than liberals. So when you encounter people like the editors at these journals and they want to criticize liberals are the enemy, what is the alternative then? Or do they see themselves as progressives, or is there another term?
They would consider themselves social justice scholars and activists. Yes, they call themselves progressives, but they also call genuine liberals progressives.
Oh.
It's a mess. When they criticise liberalism, it's very clear what they're criticising. They're criticising the idea of individual agency, of our common humanity, of meritocracy, of viewpoint diversity, all of these sort of solid things that underlie liberal secular democracies. So America is the most prominent example of a liberal secular democracy. It's still one, even though you have a Republican government, because it doesn't mean left. It means that you have the freedom to hold whatever beliefs you want. You have the freedom to say them. And this is what the social justice activists see as a problem, because they believe that language constructs social reality. They see people being able to say whatever they want as perpetuating oppression. They want to make very strong social and even legal sanctions for saying things like trans women are men, or maybe Islam isn't a religion of peace. I'm not taking either of those positions myself, although I have criticisms of both kinds of ideology, but this is the kind of thing that they think you really mustn't be able to say. So in my country, we've seen some arrests for people criticising mostly trans activism and Islam. That because of your First Amendment, but This is the threat to liberalism, is when you're no longer free to treat people as an individual. You're no longer free to believe or say what you believe.
Okay, I want to understand a few things about terms like postmodernism or post-Marxist. Now, I noticed that your book, it's called Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity. You don't say how postmodernism made everything about race, gender, and identity. Although I have to say it is strange the way these terms, postmodernism, post-Marxist, post-colonial, are getting thrown around by people who have sort of become enemies with them or are bucking up against these authoritarian tendencies in the left, in popular culture, but they don't understand those terms at all. I found myself in a rather bizarre conversation a few years ago with a right-wing media personality in the US, someone who had probably never read a page of philosophy or critical theory, who felt he had very specific ideas about postmodernism and how it was the cause of everything annoying about liberals, kind of the same way conservatives would bat around the word socialism to describe everything they hated about Barack Obama, you know?
Yeah.
So can you just explain to me, what should I know about postmodernism and how much should I care?
Okay, so Jim and I are thinking of writing another book in which we look at all the currents that have gone into what we're seeing at the moment, because it comes from so many places. There is a bit of Marxism in there, but people put far too much focus on the Marxism. It's come so far away from Marxism now that you'll just be misled if you try to treat what we're seeing now as Marxism. There's so many different currents in there, but why I focused particularly on postmodernism is because of the central concepts around language, power, and discourse. Those are very specifically postmodern. So we've got this idea that everything depends on power. Power underlies everything. Whatever we see in society, it's always serving the interests of whoever is powerful in society. So then this legitimizes certain ways of speaking about things. They call these ways of speaking about things discourses. We have dominant discourses. That is very much a Foucauldian idea. Michel Foucault and his discourse theories is the thing that comes up over and over again when we see this anxiety about language, about are you upholding white supremacy? Are you upholding patriarchy, cisnormativity? It's this concept of discourses. And then this constructs what is actually knowledge. So it comes to the point where we're saying we believe that there are, say, psychological differences on average between men and women. This cannot be accepted. They believe that if we say this is true, so for example, some of the strong evidence that men are more likely to be interested in working with things, women are more likely to be interested in working with people, their socially constructivist ideas will believe that by saying that, we make it true.
Right.
And what we need to do is say the opposite of that and make everybody else say the opposite of that, and then that will become true. So this idea of discourses, power and knowledge is ultimately postmodern. It's not how the Marxists see things. It's not how the liberals see things. The Marxists believed in an objective truth. They believed philosophy would cure the false consciousness of the working class. And so they had confidence in language and reason and trying to get there. You know, the liberals, they have the marketplace of ideas. We believe that society has advanced so much in the last 500 years because people began to be able to make their arguments. They began to be able to say what they wanted, test ideas against each other. And this was how we advanced. This isn't what the postmodernists believe. They believe that it's always a matter of powerful, dominant discourses, and they always need disrupting.
It really is a version of magical thinking, isn't it? I've never really thought about it that way before, but, you know, if you visualize it, it will manifest concept is very much what this is about. And I mean, yeah, I'm actually curious if you could talk a little bit more about your struggles with OCD and this sort of hypervigilance and self-scrutiny, because that is definitely something you see among the more extreme activists. There's a real sort of self-punishing streak in a lot of these activists, the self-flagellation. They demand it in others. They demand it in themselves. They perform it. Maybe it's not a performance. Maybe it's legitimate. Like, What's the psychological component there? Like, is there a sort of personality profile that finds themselves more vulnerable or just more interested in this way of being in the world?
I'm increasingly believing that there is a much stronger psychological component than is being accepted at the moment. I think the people who are the really zealous social justice activists calling for cancellations and firings would be in a different context. The ones, calling for the execution of the apostate or the heretic. So I think this is a psychological thing. But Jim and I, we've spoken about this a lot because we know that we are not really qualified to make arguments about the psychological factors. We've started already contacting psychologists who are, and we're hoping that we'll be able to do something with their support. We don't want to go out there and write, we think that this kind of ideology is essentially producing something much like a personality disorder. This is what we are worrying when we look at what we see. So we've got, for example, the coddling of the American mind, when Haidt and Lukianoff speak about how this kind of theory works in opposition to cognitive behavioral theory, whereas cognitive behavioral theory will train people to not catastrophize, to put things in perspective, to build their resilience, to respond appropriately. The kind of theory that we have now tells you the opposite. If you're reading something that shows oppression, racism, sexism, heteronormativity to exist, well done, you're right. We know those things exist. If you spotted them, that is authoritative. So it's working against what some of the best theories in psychology and psychiatry tell us are healthy ways to live your life. I've had increasing numbers of psychologists and psychotherapists write essays for Aereo about this, how they're seeing the effects of this, but we don't have a strong enough base in psychology yet to say anything that we could be confident about. It would be a very bad idea to make claims about mental health and psychology that weren't true.
Well, I'm sure you could have fun trying. I mean, I'm certainly not the first person to make this analogy between organized religion and this kind of social justice movement. John McWhorter has written about it a lot. Certainly many writers and observers have pointed out those similarities. But, do you see a connection there? And is it possible that because people are just not going to church as often and they don't have these kinds of community affiliations, they just are not as connected, that there's something intoxicating about being able to align yourself so vehemently with like-minded others on social media, particularly?
Yeah, I mean, I'm utterly convinced that the social justice, or critical social justice, as D'Angelo calls it, is providing for the same kind of social and psychological needs humans have as traditional religions have done. Jim wrote a wonderful piece about this called Postmodern Faith, and it's on Aereo anyway. It's a really long piece about religion and the faith-based things, because he studied the psychology of religion for 3 years and wrote a book on it. So, yeah, there's definitely very strong connections. But what worries me a little bit, that some people are arguing, and it's often American conservatives who are religious themselves, they're sort of making a moral argument that this is a consequence of people having moved away from Christianity. So they're regarding it as a kind of corrupt substitute for a healthier form of moral and sort of center of being like that religion provides.
If Twitter did not exist, how much of this would exist?
Yeah, I used to argue against that. I used to say, it's just a tool. The problem is the reasoning that's being spread. But I'm starting to think I was wrong about that this social media, the connections with so many people, the public nature of it really has brought out something quite unique, new and nasty in ourselves that is doing a lot of damage.
I see these conversations going on social media. Like, I follow this stuff closely, and it's sort of amusing and horrifying and all of the above. But like, how big an issue is this really? Is even this sort of conversation kind of in the realm of the theoretical? Like, how much of this is actually affecting real people in their day-to-day lives?
I think in certain realms you can probably go through your life not knowing any of this is happening, but you'd probably be quite safe, but you can't be sure of that. I've had to start a Discord server for people who are having a certain kind of anti-racist training imposed on them. And I've got 163 people now. I'm trying to help and support to push back at some kind of mandatory training or reading that they are being asked to do, which is explicitly an attack on freedom of belief. So I have white people telling me that they are expected to go to this meeting. They're expected to affirm that they are indeed racist. They're expected to say how they are going to dismantle the system of white supremacy. And it isn't an option to say, actually, I oppose racism from a different framework. I don't believe this. I also have a ridiculous number of Black and South Asian, mostly, people who are being expected to testify to a very certain understanding of racism. And they're under a lot of pressure to do so. They're afraid that they will be penalised if they don't see racism in the way the critical race theorists see it, if they don't have the critical social justice approach, if they are liberals or even conservatives. They still feel that they're under pressure to say, yes, racism is a system of power and privilege. It underlies everything. It's whiteness. It's worrying because what we need, the way we should be thinking about this set of ideas, it is a belief system which people should be entitled to have, express and live by, but not be imposed on anybody else. This is where the concept of secularism really needs to be expanded from just, traditionally understood religions to belief systems like this one.
So this is amazing. You set up this Discord server, and are they coming to you for advice, for specific instructions, for just empathy? Like, how does it work exactly?
There's a great combination. There's a lot of reasons why people get in touch with us, but they were getting in touch with all of this. I was getting hundreds of emails a day at first, then it's slowed now to dozens. Jim was actually waking up to 1,000 emails in the morning. And Mike Naina and Peter as well. We just couldn't manage it all.
Mike Naina is the filmmaker who did he make a short film about your hoax, or explain to us who he is?
He's involved in quite a lot of shorter documentaries, and he's planning a full-length one. He's very knowledgeable now about the theory. He's gone right into it. So he's,
okay. So you guys are all hearing from people from all over the world. Do they tend to be in the UK and in the US, or where do they come from?
What seems to be happening, the people who reach out to me seem to be mostly either British or women.
Not only one or the other, though, yes.
Well, the Americans I get tend to be women. I think most people have been going to Jim because most people are American and they're seeing him addressing it. But there's still an awful lot coming to me. And yes, most people are coming because they're being expected to do some kind of anti-racist training, which has assumptions that they don't think are either true or ethical. And they want to be able to push back at this without losing their jobs. So we're doing that. But there's also a lot of people, and this is particularly women, who are socially afraid. They're scared that they're going to say the wrong thing, that they're going to get dogpiled on social media, that their Facebook groups will turn on them. And this is also their social circle in real life. Right. So there's really quite a level of fear. I had a young woman write to me and in a real state. She was an American woman in her early 20s, and she'd disagreed with a lady on a group chat who was Pakistani and was immediately accused of racism. And then suddenly all of these people who she'd got on great with were just suddenly descending upon her, and nothing she could say. She apologized, it didn't work. And she was in a really terrible state. She was messaging me saying, I'm so frightened, what am I going to do? And this is a ridiculous state of affairs. And that's what I'm seeing a lot. Women seem to be particularly vulnerable to the social side of it.
Yeah, this is something I talked about with Heather Hying a couple of weeks ago. I think that women, and again, I'm being very gender essentialist here, but I think that women in the aggregate, not all of us, are maybe more susceptible to in-group, out-group dynamics and exclusionary systems of social penalties and that sort of thing. I wanted to ask you, like, the woman whose book club is reading White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo and doesn't want to read the book, the woman who finds herself in this position of, being assigned this book by her club, and she doesn't want to read it. Maybe she's already read it, maybe she hasn't read it, but she knows enough about it to know she doesn't want to get into it. What should she say? How does she handle that situation? And can she even say anything without actually reading the book?
Well, it does certainly help to read the book, but there are enough breakdowns of DiAngelo for people to know what they're likely to have a conscientious objection to if they do. So we've been helping people to address quite a lot of these different situations. And the two most important things to convey is first that you are coming from a place of knowledge, not ignorance. It's not just that you need to be educated and then you'll understand. And that you're coming from a place of principles, not bigotry. You're not objecting to this approach to anti-racism because you want to be racist. So this is the two things to establish, and then ask people if they can be more inclusive of a greater range of worldviews. This is what we've had some success with, but I have to admit the success that most times we have been really successful with this approach is when the person who is objecting is Black or South Asian. If a white person objects, they're much more likely to get dismissed. But we had a really good situation where a Black guy said that he wanted his work to stop going on about whiteness and acknowledging their privilege to him, because he experienced this as insulting, because he'd worked very hard to get where he was. He didn't want to keep hearing how much more privileged everyone else was. He had a different value system, which was rooted in his culture, and it was about dignity and self-sufficiency, and it needed to stop. And that worked really well because they got back to him and apologized. And then his work backed off immediately from instituting the DiAngelo approach.
But that was because he was a Black man.
Yeah.
Or maybe people of color could make themselves available to white people as sort of, kind of agents.
Then again, there's a different level of risk there as well. I think sometimes people think white people are more at risk of criticising anti-racism, but I'm not at all convinced that's true. Having spoken to, particularly in the UK, it's a lot of South Asian, Indian or Pakistani, Bangladeshi women who are talking to me about this, and they are really worried that they won't only get accused by their workplace of supporting white supremacy, but they will also lose a lot of their supportive social circle. It feels like a much bigger risk to criticise anti-racist actions if you're supposedly a beneficiary of them. They often feel that they have to go really, really carefully into this because...
Right.
Yeah.
Very, very good point.
Being called a traitor to your own race, I think, is possibly more painful than just being called a white supremacist.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, but that's the thing with quote unquote cancel culture, right? You can only be canceled by your own side. So this idea that, the right has been canceling the left forever, that doesn't square. That's not what we're talking about. Okay, Helen, I want to run by you 3 fairly well-known examples. Well, maybe 2 sort of well-known ones and not one less so. Examples of bullying in the name of social justice, or just sort of high-profile scenarios where these things have played out. And I'm hoping you can explain what the theoretical rationale or underpinnings might be for each of those. Okay, so the first one is the cancellation of J.K. Rowling. I think most people are probably a little bit familiar with this. J.K. Rowling has been accused of being a TERF by trans activists, even though she's made pretty clear that she's not transphobic, has nothing against trans people, but she just has certain feminist principles that don't exactly line up. So can you tell us what's behind all of that?
Yeah, J.K. Rowling has taken the gender critical position. So she believes that woman is a biological category, that the difficulties that women face are directly related to their biology and the role that this has given them in life. So I don't agree with that, and many people don't. In her letter, she said that misogyny is increasing. I don't think that's true. However, this is a perfectly reasonable feminist position. She has perfectly reasonable concerns about how uncritically accepting trans women as women in every situation could affect women's sports, women's spaces. There's issues of fairness and safety, and we need really ethical people to be making these arguments. I think J.K. Rowling is one. But she's going to get pushed back at this. She's going to get called transphobic. It's going to be vicious, because what she is doing is using her huge platform to make an ethical argument specifically against the trans position. And I'm sure she absolutely knew what would happen. And this is a sacrifice that she's actually willing to make because she thinks the issue is so important. So for that reason, I have quite a lot of respect for her, even though I can't quite meet her where she is. But because this is a thing in language, people can't argue with her. So what we're hearing coming back, and, you know, from some of the leading actors in Harry Potter, is just the mantra, trans women are women, trans women are women, that trans women shouldn't be judged for who they are or told who they are, trans women are women. This is the discourse thing going on. They want to reconstruct reality to make it fairer for trans people. This means that J.K. Rowling's argument cannot be responded to on its own terms.
Okay. So the second example is the cancellation, and I'm putting cancellation in quotes because who knows how long it's actually going to last, but the supposed cancellation of a data analyst named David Shore. This was in the US, who was fired for tweeting about a paper, not even tweeting his own paper or saying anything in the tweet. He tweeted about a paper by a Princeton professor that showed that peaceful civil rights protests were more effective than violent ones. Going out on a limb there. So that apparently violated some kind of progressive social norm, dictating, as you mentioned earlier, that any criticism of any kind of protest is racist or something like that.
Yeah, I think what David Shore has walked into, seemingly without knowing, is the sort of ongoing thing in critical race theory, where there is a debate about two different approaches to overcoming racism. So there was the liberation theology and uplift suasion. I don't know if you know about this. This was when arguments were made drawing on people like Du Bois, saying that what black people need to do is be ultra respectable, to get themselves educated, to be thoroughly law-abiding.
A respectability politics, yeah.
Yes, respectability politics. And this was argued that this would make white America accept black people. And this caused quite a lot of religiousness and conservatism in black communities, and blaming and shaming of people who didn't fall in with that. So the reaction against this that we're seeing a lot at the moment from people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram Kendi, Michelle Alexander, they're all pushing back at this, saying that this was an attempt to keep, this just keeps black people down. This is blaming them. So what's happened when David Shore has made this study, which shows that actually it's more effective not to be violent, is he was seen as speaking into this uplift suasion, respectability politics, liberation theology type discourse, which is very much out of vogue at the moment. So he probably has absolutely no idea of this. It's a particular problem because he was simply reporting an academic study, and it's essential that people are able to do that. But he was accused of anti-blackness immediately, was clearly confused about this, and didn't know what was happening. If you haven't looked into all of this theory, you just see people reading him into a particular discourse of power, which he probably has no idea even exists.
Yeah, just the idea that pointing something out is tantamount to endorsing it. It's so pervasive and it's so just illogical, but it's all around us. Okay, so the third example, this is a case many people might not be familiar with, and it's pretty astonishing and ultimately heartbreaking. This is a case of a man named Cedric Sunray, who is a social justice-minded college recruiter in the U.S. who was fired in the wake of a privilege walk exercise gone terribly wrong at an Oklahoma City charter school that happened to have a diverse student population. I think he was actually with, I don't want to get this wrong, but it was like a some kind of Christian university in Oklahoma. So it's not like he was coming from Oberlin or some liberal arts college where this would be part of the vocabulary. So he came to this school, he had the students line up, and he asked them to line up according to their hair texture and skin tone. And the kids were totally confused and then extremely upset. This became a media story. And it was reported as an example of this just inexplicable, blatant racism. But, it's funny. When I read the story and I saw, oh, he's lining these kids up, he's asking him to do this, this is bizarre. Most people would say that, like, my God, what a bigot. It was obvious that he was trying to do this intersectional exercise that you see a lot of going on a lot of diversity and inclusion corporate training and on a lot of college campuses. But because he didn't, it's not like he was able to line them up according to anything other than skin tone and hair texture. It just came out totally wrong. So anyway, his response to all this was absolutely heartbreaking because he was coming from a place of real social justice activism in his mind, but it completely bit him in the butt. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think that's another example of what they call the eating their own and circular firing squads. But what this comes down to in a lot of the scholarship is the method of problematizing. So this is essentially the methodology of social justice scholarship and activism, is that you try to read problems into things, because the understanding is that we're so accustomed to these systems of power and privilege that we can't see them, which is where the idea of woke comes from. These are the people who are able to see them to a certain extent. There's a lot of incentive to problematize, to see a problem with something. Now, once that ball has started rolling, Mr. Sunray, who I understand to be a white-skinned Native American man who's very much focused on social justice activism. Yeah, there wasn't anything he could have done. What he's done now, I was reading, is he's taken responsibility for it. He said that the students who are upset must not be blamed or made to feel guilty. So he's still in that social justice space. He might survive, but he might not. And it's a problem because there's nothing reasonable in this. He couldn't have done the right thing. And this is what's going to happen to people within this space over and over again. They're going to try to do the right thing. Somebody is going to find a way to problematize something they've done. They try to explain themselves, and then the deluge just comes all over them. We see it in, Evergreen College. We saw it in the knitting community at Ravelry, in young adult books. People try to be woke, they get it slightly wrong, and then there's blood in the water, and everybody else is at them trying to prove their own superior wokeness because they've seen something that person hasn't. It's horrible. It's so ugly.
So do you advise people to not apologize? Does this come up on the Discord server? Do they say, like, oh my gosh, I'm in this position now, I'm being attacked, how do I handle it?
I would advise people not to apologise. Yes, if they don't subscribe to these beliefs in the first place, then I would advise people to say, I don't have that concept of racism. I have principles of individuality. I have principles of consistently liberal ethics, or whatever the situation happens to be. Of course, a lot of the time I'm trying to help people to keep their jobs, but I don't think apologising is going to work on a social level. It might do on an employment level, because you can say something like, I was ignorant, and thank you for educating me. I will try to do better, and it can pass off. That's unlikely to happen on social media. But if you're in a woke space,
the woke place. I'm calling it the woke place.
Yes. Anything you try and say after this has happened is just going to make things worse. It's going to be problematized again. Once you've been identified as a target for problematization, that's it. You just really need to leave that space. That's what I said to the young woman who was so upset. Don't try to explain yourself to them. Just go away. That will make it die down quickest. Go back in a month and see what's happening, because the more you engage, the worse it's going to be.
just by way of wrapping this up, your last chapter is devoted to alternatives to social justice ideology. So could you say briefly what some of those alternatives might be, and whether you have hope that this is kind of going to blow over, that we're going to that the pendulum is going to swing back to the center and we can kind of all get back to rational thinking?
Yeah, our aim in the last chapter of the book is to try to give people confidence to push back from a principled position, because we believe that the majority of people are liberal in that very broad sense. They want to treat people as individuals. They don't want a racist or sexist or homophobic society, but they don't want this kind of theoretical extremism either. So we're trying to explain how it works. That was the first 9 chapters of the book. In the last one, we're trying to explain how to push back at it. So you could be able to say quite confidently, I think racism is a problem. It continues to exist. It needs to be pushed back at, but we don't have to believe in invisible systems of power. We can believe in individuals' responsibility to not be racist and to oppose racism. So this is a liberal approach, which is very different to the social justice approach. And I think the problem that we're seeing now is that while most people have this liberal sense of fairness, I won't judge you by your race, sex, you don't judge me by mine, they've never really had to defend this. And so they get mostly confused. And what we need is for people to really be quite confident and just say, no, this isn't fair, this isn't consistent, I don't support it. As to whether I think this can sort of come back to the centre, I'm getting less optimistic about that. I was hoping for a while that what would happen would be that increasing numbers of people would see the problem with the social justice approach, that it would lose respectability in the academy and that people would start to distance themselves from it, and that it would gradually subside, and then everyone would say we were, making a moral panic about a problem that never existed. That didn't happen. And I think the combination of people feeling an existential threat from the coronavirus and then the killing of George Floyd, it just caused all this sort of toxic theoretical activist stuff that's been bubbling up in little spots here and there throughout society has suddenly had an explosion now. So we are seeing a real attempted cultural revolution. And I don't think it can succeed. It's too inconsistent, it's too counterintuitive, and it's just not ethical or reasonable. So I'm still hoping that a pushback will be liberal, that it can be based on liberal ethics, which will allow us to keep the progress that we have made on racial, gender and LGBT equality. But my fear is that we're going to see a continuing surge to the right. It's going to be a nationalistic, populist right. It's going to get confident. It's going to squash critical social justice. And then we'll have to have another fight against them to try and get back to a more liberal society.
Right. Well, but maybe that's something that's sort of easier to wrap our minds around. Maybe there's more room for bigger numbers of people coming together over something like that, because it's just more tangible. It's easier to understand. Well, your book has come along at the perfect time. So thank you, Helen, for speaking with me on the program. And congratulations to you and your co-author, James Lindsay, on the book.
Thank you, Megan. It's been nice talking to you.
That was my interview with Helen Pluckrose. She is the co-author, along with James Lindsay, of Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody, which is just out from Pitchstone Books. She is also the editor, by the way, of Aereo magazine, an online journal focusing on current affairs. Helen spoke with me from her home in East London on August 21st. You've been listening to The Unspeakable Podcast with meghandaum. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and Google Podcasts. And for more information, you can visit theunspeakablepodcast.com, and you can listen there too. Please consider supporting the podcast on its brand new Patreon page. That's patreon.com/theunspeakable. I hope you'll tune in next week. I'll announce the new guest very soon on the website and the usual social media spaces. Thanks for listening. See you next time.